He hasn't thrown anything away in 30 years, and his garage proves it. There is a particular room in countless American homes that has quietly become off-limits to ordinary household logic, a space where the normal rules of decluttering, organizing, and discarding simply don't apply. Walk into his garage, and you'll find coffee cans full of mismatched screws collected across 3 decades, a stack of newspapers from years that no longer matter, at least 4 broken appliances he insists he'll fix eventually, and a single, unmovable conviction underneath all of it. None of this is actually junk, no matter how thoroughly it might look that way to everyone else. The wise observer has watched this pattern play out in garage after garage, workshop after workshop, and it deserves careful, compassionate attention rather than simple eye-rolling dismissal. This isn't really about clutter, and it isn't really about laziness or disorganization, despite how it often appears to family members who have spent years gently, then not so gently, suggesting he finally clear some of it out. Underneath every retained object, every coffee can of mismatched hardware, every appliance awaiting a repair that may never actually happen, sits something far more psychologically significant than simple accumulation. To understand this pattern, the wise observer must look, once again, at the specific economic and emotional conditions that shaped so much of this generation's early adulthood. Many Gen X men came of age during periods of genuine financial instability, recessions, layoffs, unpredictable job markets that taught a durable, bone-deep lesson. You never know when you'll need something, and replacing an item you threw away too hastily can cost money you might not actually have. This lesson, learned during formative years of real scarcity, doesn't simply fade once financial stability eventually arrives. It calcifies into a permanent orientation toward objects, one where discarding something usable feels less like decluttering and more like reckless, almost irresponsible waste. Consider what this actually looks like in practice, item by item, across an average garage. That coffee can of mismatched screws represents dozens of small home repairs completed without an extra trip to the hardware store, each one a tiny victory of self-sufficiency he's not eager to abandon. That broken appliance, sitting untouched for 3 years, represents a repair he genuinely intends to complete someday. A small, unfinished project that feels less like clutter to him and more like an open possibility he isn't ready to close off permanently. Even the stack of old newspapers carries, in his mind, some vague future utility wrapping fragile items during a move, starting a fire, insulating something in a pinch, utility that exists more as psychological comfort than as any realistic likelihood of actual use. The wise observer wants to name something important here. This pattern isn't really about the objects themselves, it's about what letting go of them represents. For a man whose sense of security was shaped by genuine scarcity, keeping things provides a specific, tangible feeling of preparedness, a defense against a world that has, at some point in his life, proven itself capable of demanding more resourcefulness than he had readily available resources to meet. Every retained item is a small insurance policy against a version of hardship he experienced once and has never fully stopped bracing against. There's a particular scene worth picturing that captures this pattern with real clarity. His wife, attempting a long-overdue garage cleanout, holds up a rusted, clearly non-functional tool and asks, reasonably, whether they can finally throw it away. He hesitates, genuinely conflicted, before explaining that it still has some life left in it, that he might need it someday, that throwing away something that could theoretically still serve a purpose feels wasteful in a way he struggles to fully articulate even to himself. The tool goes back on the shelf, exactly where it's been for the past decade, and the clean-out effort quietly stalls, item by item, until the garage remains largely unchanged. This pattern often intensifies specifically around objects with even the faintest sentimental connection layered on top of their practical justification. A tool that belonged to his own father carries a weight that goes far beyond its actual usefulness, functioning less as a hardware item and more as a physical link to a parent who may no longer be alive to provide any other form of connection. Discarding that tool doesn't just feel wasteful. It feels, on some deep and rarely articulated level, like discarding a piece of his relationship with his father, a connection he's unwilling to sever even when the object itself serves no practical function whatsoever. The wise observer wants to point out something particularly poignant about how this pattern intersects with his broader relationship to control. Much of his adult life, as discussed in other contexts, has been organized around managing uncertainty, preparing for contingencies, maintaining tight control over the variables he actually can influence. A garage full of retained objects represents perhaps the most literal, physical manifestation of this broader psychological pattern, a space where every item represents a contingency planned for, a problem preemptively solved, a small pocket of the world where he retains complete control over what might be needed and when. It's worth examining how this pattern shows up specifically in conflict with his wife, who often experiences the accumulated garage very differently than he does. Where he sees a carefully curated resource of potential solutions, she often sees an overwhelming, disorganized burden that limits actual usable space, generates ongoing tension about home organization, and represents years of promised cleanouts that never quite materialize. This isn't simply a difference in tidiness preferences. It's a genuine collision between two fundamentally different relationships to uncertainty and security, each partner's approach shaped by different formative experiences, neither fully recognizes in the moment of an argument about garage space. There's a specific tenderness worth naming in how adult children often experience this pattern, particularly as they age and eventually face the reality of someday clearing out their parents' home. Many describe genuine dread at the prospect, understanding intellectually that most of it holds little value, while recognizing that dismissing it too quickly risks discarding something that genuinely mattered to their father, buried somewhere within the objectively useless items surrounding it. The wise observer also wants to acknowledge how this pattern sometimes intersects with genuine skill that shouldn't be entirely dismissed. Unlike more severe hoarding patterns that compromise basic living conditions, many of these men retain a functional ability to actually use what they've kept successfully repairing something, with parts salvaged from an old appliance. Solving a problem with exactly the right screw pulled from a coffee can that seemed like pure clutter until the precise moment it wasn't. There's a particular irony worth naming in how selectively this retention pattern operates. He may readily discard genuinely sentimental items with little practical use, old greeting cards, outdated clothing, while fiercely protecting items with purely theoretical utility that carry no emotional weight whatsoever. This reveals something important. The pattern isn't primarily about sentiment. It's about a specific, practical anxiety around resourcefulness that operates according to its own internal logic, largely independent of conventional emotional attachment. It's worth examining how this pattern shows up in his relationship to organizational systems, where genuine contradiction often emerges. He may possess remarkable organizational skill in certain domains, perfectly labeled tools, a meticulous filing system, while allowing an entirely different category of objects to accumulate in genuine chaos. The organized areas represent items he's already decided have clear purpose. The chaotic accumulation represents items in permanent limbo, neither useful enough to organize nor disposable enough to release, resisting resolution, because committing to either would require a decision he's not ready to make. There's a specific scene worth picturing that illustrates how this pattern often intersects with genuine, occasional vindication. A specific part, salvaged from an appliance discarded by everyone else's logic years ago, turns out to be exactly what's needed to fix a lawnmower engine on a Saturday afternoon, proving conclusively that his instinct to keep things was correct all along. These moments of vindication, however statistically rare, carry disproportionate psychological weight, overriding the dozens of items that never once proved useful. The wise observer wants to point out something specific about how this pattern often intensifies rather than eases as men age, contrary to what might seem logical given decreasing physical capacity to use these items. Many describe increasing reluctance to discard things specifically because retirement has reduced their sense of ongoing productive capability elsewhere. The garage, filled with retained potential, becomes one of the few remaining spaces where he still feels resourceful and useful qualities that feel increasingly precious to protect, as other avenues for demonstrating competence have quietly diminished. It's worth noting, too, how this pattern intersects with his relationship to his own mortality, a connection rarely discussed directly, but worth naming honestly. On some level, many understand that a garage full of retained objects will eventually become someone else's burden to sort through, and yet this awareness rarely translates into proactive cleanup, precisely because engaging with that eventual clearing means engaging with his own eventual absence, a confrontation many find easier to postpone than to address directly, even when the wisdom of addressing it now, while he can still participate, seems obvious to everyone watching. Families who successfully navigate garage cleanouts with these men often describe collaborative rather than adversarial approaches, sorting through items together rather than presenting an ultimatum, allowing him to explain the story or purpose behind specific objects before deciding their fate, distinguishing gently between items with genuine sentimental weight worth preserving and the broader accumulation that exists primarily out of old habit rather than actual attachment. There's a particular tenderness worth naming in how this pattern shows up around tools tied to his working years, especially once retirement arrives. Professional tools that once represented daily competence don't simply become obsolete once he stops using them. They remain physically present as tangible evidence of an identity retirement threatens to make abstract. Letting go of a specialized tool he hasn't touched in years can feel less like decluttering and more like formally acknowledging that a significant chapter of his working identity has closed. The wise observer also wants to acknowledge how this pattern often becomes a source of humor within families, alongside real frustration. Adult children frequently develop an affectionate, exasperated running joke about their father's garage, complete with legendary items, the mysterious unidentified box, the appliance almost fixed for over a decade, cords for devices no one has owned in 15 years. This humor often coexists with genuine underlying tension about usable space that never quite gets fully resolved. It's worth examining how this pattern shows up differently in men who experienced genuine poverty versus more moderate financial instability. Men who experience the most severe scarcity often display the most intense version of this retention pattern, sometimes extending well beyond garages into kitchens and closets throughout the house, suggesting the severity of the pattern correlates directly with the severity of the original scarcity that created it. There's a specific scene worth picturing that illustrates how this pattern sometimes finally shifts, often prompted by a concrete life transition rather than gradual persuasion. Facing an actual downsizing move, forced by health considerations or simple practicality, many of these men discover they're capable of far more decisive sorting than anyone expected, precisely because the abstract need to eventually deal with the garage suddenly becomes a concrete deadline. Many describe feeling, somewhat to their own surprise, genuine relief once the sorting is finally complete, rather than the grief they'd expected throughout the process. There is real hope embedded in this pattern, though addressing it requires genuine understanding rather than simple confrontation. Families who successfully navigate garage cleanouts with these men often describe collaborative rather than adversarial approaches, sorting through items together rather than presenting an ultimatum, allowing him to explain the story or purpose behind specific objects before deciding their fate, distinguishing gently between items with genuine sentimental weight worth preserving and the broader accumulation that exists primarily out of old habit rather than actual attachment. The wise observer's closing thought is this: if you love a man whose garage has become a monument to 3 decades of retained objects, understand that this isn't simple stubbornness or disorganization. It's the physical architecture of an old, deeply rational response to real scarcity he once experienced, preserved long after the actual danger has passed. The most valuable approach isn't insisting he simply let go, but patiently helping him distinguish between the genuine security those objects once provided and the reality that he no longer needs quite so much insurance against a world that, for now at least, has become considerably more stable than the one that first taught him never to throw anything away.